All right, welcome back to another episode of Words of the Wise. Today I have Chief Quinn from Edwardsville PD in Kansas. This is his 32nd year in law enforcement. Welcome to the show, Chief Quinn. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Paige. Excited to be here, and thank you for having me.
Of course, no, I'm really looking forward to it. All right, rewind 32 years. Tell us a little bit about you and your law enforcement journey.
Sure. Interesting fact about me is I started in Edwardsville, Kansas, where I'm currently the chief of police back in 1989. I was here for about 2 years, and I went to a little bit bigger agency for about 3 years. And then I went to Kansas City, Kansas, which is a much larger jurisdiction, more crime. I was young, I was full of everything, and I decided I wanted to go fight crime, on a bigger department anyway. I retired there from there in October of 2020, and the position as chief popped up here in Edwardsville, and everybody that I know said, "Hey, you should apply. You should apply. Go ahead." And I'm like, "No, I'm good." And they said, "You should apply," and I did, and I was lucky enough to land a spot here. So I made a full circle.
Yeah, and did you always want to be chief? Was that always something that you strived for when you were coming up and, rising through the ranks of your career?
I get asked that a lot, and my answer initially is no. However, I'm always about what's next. That what's next in my career, and so each time I was lucky enough to be advanced in an assignment or to be promoted to the next level, because there were several promotions that went along with that. When I left Kansas City, Kansas, I was in a deputy chief role, and so I never aspired to be, hey, I want to be this or that. It was always like, once I made detective, what's next? And what can I do next? Well, that would be the captain rank. Once I made captain, it's like, well, all right, what's next? And,
Yeah.
that was the major rank. And then what's next? Deputy chief. And then obviously after that, it was like, okay, chief of police would be next. How can I go about doing that? And so that's kind of how it unfolded.
Yeah, I'm a really big fan of forward movement and not staying stagnant. And I think that there are ways that we can do that within existing roles, right? Like there are ways that you can continue to develop and learn and grow and strive to be better every day than maybe you were the day before. But I really agree with you that I think having that mindset of what's next, how can I be better, how can I grow, what do I need to do, helps you, I think, to stay excited about what you're doing and keep that motivation for what you're doing, because I think as soon as you kind of feel like you're stuck and you're stagnant in a position, that's when we start to see some of that burnout happen. Do you feel like because you had that mindset of like, all right, what's next? Like, how can I keep going? That it created more of that longevity in the career without burning you out?
Absolutely. And I think it's funny you say that, because I was thinking the exact same thing as you were speaking there, is that it always motivated me as like a challenge. In my next role, I have to learn stuff all over again. Even though I've been a police officer for a number of years, you kind of know what police work's all about, but you don't know what that exact position is about. And so it excites you. It causes you to learn. It allows you to reach out and touch new people that you haven't talked to before, or make connections that you had not before. And so it really does kind of increase your chances of longevity. I know there's people that may not want to be a chief of police. Again, I didn't aspire to be that. However, you get in a role that's like, let's say I'm in Unit A, and I'm in Unit A for 5 years, and I start to become stagnant, like you're talking about. I start feeling like, oh, I'm so tired of this. I don't want to get up. I don't want to go to work, that sort of thing. Well, if you don't want to take the next rank, what about a different unit? Go to Unit B. In Unit B, you're going to make different connections. You're going to do a little bit different work, and maybe that'll excite you again. And you're able to kind of like jump over some of those hurdles that you talked about burnout and feeling stagnant and feeling pigeonholed in a position and that sort of thing. And
Yeah.
it really does help. And I think that's one of the things. And you had asked me earlier before we started taping here about, how is it that I was able to go out or have a 32-year career without getting burned out and stuff. And I think that's a big part of it, is always, wondering what's next, and having some movement, even if it's lateral in your career, just move.
Yeah.
If I sat on the couch and drank pop and ate potato chips all day long without moving, I know I'm going to have health issues.
Yeah.
And maybe mentally in your own head, wherever you're at in whatever career, whether it's law enforcement or something else, just move around, try to stay with the same company maybe, so you have tenure and you have, advanced chances there, that sort of thing. But move around, different units, that sort of thing.
When you said that in my head, this like image of stagnant water and then like moving water, like kind of side by
Yes.
side. Like we've all seen that before. Like what does stagnant water look like? It's kind of like yucky, dirty, flies, mosquitoes, whatever. Like it's just kind of
Yes.
like ugh. And moving water is fresh, right? You can see like there's um the fresh water coming in and it's recycling some of that old stuff out, right? And that's what happens. And so I like that you said that. Like if you sit on the couch, you might become more like that image of like that stagnant water. But if you're moving a little bit, you're getting fresh perspective. You're, able to move and develop and grow. And I like what you said earlier about having like always being a learner and having a learner's mindset. I think that a lot of people are afraid of change, and afraid to be new at things. I see it, when I work with people that, you know, it's this fear or maybe embarrassment of like starting from ground zero and like step one. But I think if we can kind of get outside of ourselves a little bit and step out of that comfort zone, it's such a huge opportunity for us to be the best versions of ourselves and to give ourselves some grace and understand, like, yeah, like if you are learning something completely new, you're gonna maybe like not be the best at it right away. And that's the point, because you're learning something new. And so I think that sometimes fear or embarrassment holds us back from having that learner and growth mindset. So um,
Absolutely.
I'm with you on that. So you kind of had that full circle journey back to where you are now. How did that journey of, working for a smaller agency and then some larger agencies and now coming back, how did that shape your perspective as a leader? Did you learn anything like the differences between maybe smaller and larger organizations, or did it give you any sort of perspective that you can now take with you into this existing role?
Oh, for sure. And I would say initially it was back uh, 25, 28 years ago. I initially made the transition from a smaller agency to a larger agency. During one of the conversations I had with somebody from the larger agency, I had mentioned, and they got a little bit offended, that you have a better, well-rounded officer from a smaller agency. And they're like, what do you mean? We handle this and we handle that. And I'm like, but you're from the smaller agency's perspective, you might go on a call for service, if you will. That's a crime that's created. Not only are you taking the report, you're taking witness statements, you're taking victim statements, you're looking for evidence, you're bagging and tagging, all of that kind of stuff. You're preparing the case, maybe pushing it through the district attorney's office, all of that. You're doing it all.
Hmm.
And whereas a larger agency, you have individual units or personnel who handle those things. And so, larger agency, the officers might be able to handle a disturbance quicker because they've done 20 a day versus one or two a week at a smaller agency. And so they're great at handling a disturbance, but they aren't so great at collecting evidence or taking a witness statement and those sort of things. And so I was able to see that when I initially went. Once I got used to the larger, it was kind of weird. But, I got used to the personnel who did these different things.
Mm.
And I come back to a smaller agency here again. I'm like, wait a minute, who does this? Well, that person does A, B, C, D, and E. They wear all those hats. I'm like, well, that's crazy to me because of my mindset was a larger organization. And so I'm finding myself having to adjust back to a smaller agency to be able to wear multiple hats and then take it upon myself to do things because they need to get done.
Yeah, that's really interesting. You know, having the perspective of like going from doing everything, and having, like you said, all these different hats and being able to like be like really well versed in a lot of different things to going to another place where it's all delegated and there's different people for those different things. And then to come back and be like, wait, it's not delegated anymore. Like we all gotta,
Right.
and come back. How do you think wellness is impacted between like smaller agencies and larger agencies? Because I've heard different opinions of this. I've heard from a smaller organization, maybe it's a little bit easier to build culture because you know each other and kind of close knit, but then it's also harder because no one wants to talk to each other about certain things and everyone kind of knows each other. But then from a larger organization, like maybe there's more resources for wellness, but people kind of get lost in within the organization because there's so many people. So do you have any experience in kind of the differences between um, not even just wellness programming, but just wellness in general within an organization, with a small versus a large?
Sure. Initially, when I went from the smaller agency to the larger agency, I did not, and I was just a number, if you will.
Mm,
I agree, and I can clearly tell you've spoken to a wide variety of people about these situations because what you described is exactly right. At a smaller agency, you can notice you know everybody. And so one person is a little off, meaning, they're acting a little bit different. They're not talking, they're not smiling like they normally do. Maybe they're showing up for work a few minutes late where they don't normally do that. They're calling in sick much more than they used to. All of these classic signs, if you will, you notice that much more on a smaller agency, at least from the top down. Larger agency, if you're paying attention, you're a supervisor, for instance, and you have 10, 15 people under your command, you would notice that, but it's not noticed from that level all the way to the top because you're lost in the amount of numbers that you have. And
right.
so, and word doesn't spread. People don't like to talk about those kind of things because there's this stigma, and it still exists of, if you show anything like that, you're weak. We don't need weak people around here. And in all reality, we want people to be strong and healthy and be successful in what they do.
Mm,
As far as getting involved in officer wellness and those sort of things, I would say my closest example was I became in 2013, I believe it was, the CIT or Crisis Intervention Team coordinator for the Kansas City, Kansas Police Department. And during that, I began to have my eyes opened for me because it's not something that historically officers like, I want to go be CIT. It's
yeah.
more of a, hey, you're going to be voluntold to go do this. And then more often than not, the people like myself, our eyes are open to the CIT concept, which is dealing with citizens and they're suffering in a mental crisis, right? And so once your eyes are open to that, like this is stuff that we could use every day. And then I started thinking we don't have a whole lot of stuff that we could use on each other, meaning if I notice somebody's calling in sick or they're a little bit more they act a little bit outside themselves. They're a little bit more gruff than they usually are. They're not smiling. They're just something's off about that person. Why couldn't we use the same techniques we're using in CIT for our peers, our subordinates, our people above us, supervisors, our people we work with every day. And so
Yeah.
I kind of instituted some of that within our CIT program to like really kind of branch out and say, hey, this would be great for all of us, to use and be when time will allot for all of us to be better mentally prepared for what we do.
Yeah. I really like that you said we want our people to be healthy and successful because it's such a simple explanation that encompasses so much. It's not about being weak, it's about being healthy and successful in your career and also in your life, because we know that it all intertwines. As much as I think everyone likes to say, like, don't take work home and don't take home to work, like, there's always going to be a little bit of seepage in that. And of course, there's strategies to be able to, like, you know, decompress and offload some of the stuff and, have effective communication and all the things. I think that you are humans and, living life, and it's always going to have some crossover. But to have a simple explanation of, like, how can we just proactively and also reactively make sure that you are healthy and successful. I really liked that. And um, when you were talking just now about how, you were saying that you knew how to work within the community, but maybe didn't have those same resources internally. Um, I think that you guys are really, really good at taking care of other people and sometimes maybe not so good at taking care of yourselves. Because to your point, it's like I can understand it. I can understand how you could see someone in the community who's struggling, and maybe you are also struggling in a similar way, but not wanting to show that because of the position that you're in your career. Like I can totally understand that mindset of like, well, I'm not like that, or I am not allowed to be like that because of my role within the community and within this organization. But I think that if you can try to create that culture where it's like, hey, like if this impacts you, it doesn't mean that you're weak. It means that you're human. And we're going to do what we can so that it doesn't turn into a huge issue because it doesn't have to all the time, right? It's usually the undealt with stuff that leads to those things. So, of course, you want to have resources on the back end if that happens, but how can we be more proactive on the front end? And one of the things that you told me when we, initially spoke that really just stuck out to me, and I was hoping you could explain a little bit more about what you meant by this, but you said the more that you walk through mud, the harder it is to wash it off. Can you dive into that a little bit? What did you mean by that?
Sure. I think, there's this misconception that, there are some, I would say, crooked police officers out there, or there are police officers who don't care about what goes on in the community. They're just a number taking up space in a car out somewhere driving around looking to mess with people.
Mm,
But I think honestly, the really what happens is that I think that 99.9% of the people go into police work thinking they're going to do the right things, they're going to love what they do, they're going to help others, they're going to do all these things that really does better their community. But in the end, you're exposed to so much negativity that you really are every day exposed to these things that it begins to stick. And, I know when we spoke before, I said it sticks to you like mud. And before you know it, you have so much mud on you because you're just every call, every negative thing that you show up on, because there's very little positive encounters that you have in law enforcement. I'm a big believer in trying to increase those for your organization to have those positive encounters because that helps wash off the mud that I'm talking about.
mm,
So if you get enough of that mud on you and you have no way to wash it off, before you know it, you start to begin to be negative and you start to feel dirty on the inside. I mean, mentally, I don't mean physically. I just mean you start feeling like, I think when you see an article in the news about, an officer was convicted of stealing, or an officer was convicted of taking narcotics, or an officer was convicted of this, I would be willing to bet that the majority of those times that officer didn't start out that way. I think what happens is that they're exposed to so much negative stuff that, you take 1,000 times, you take money off a drug dealer, for instance, eventually you get their perception of like, man, if this guy can do it, maybe so can I. Not saying it's right. I'm just saying that that's just the realization of exposed to it every day, and you're not washing off that mud, if you will. And before you know it, like that drug dealer's not going to miss $10, they're not going to miss $50. And before you know it, they're falling into the same trap that the people that they're dealing with have fallen into. Because honestly, I don't think that the people that we're dealing with started out believing that they were going to be some sort of, you know, society by stealing and robbing and those kind of things. I think it's the environment that they were in. I think it's the exposures that they've had that's caused them to do what they do. And, somehow or another, we have to kind of like figure out a way, which I love. I'm skeptical by nature. And so I was skeptical of you when you first contacted me. No offense meant. But once I began to learn what you're out doing, which is helping officers and personnel wash this mud off, it is like, okay, how can I help? And so that's why I sit here today. And so that's what I mean by washing off the mud.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And I completely agree. There's a few things I want to touch on. And one is if you think about it, okay, and maybe this is going to go a little bit too like left field, so let me know if we're tracking here. But to what you said, no one is born bad, right? Like we think of that. Like there you see this like newborn baby and they're perfect, right? Like they're perfect in exactly how they are. And then over time you start to see the development. And I do think that you are a product of your environment. And if your environment is hard or bad, then the likelihood is higher, right? It's not, that doesn't mean that that's who you're going to be. I think that you can change your environment, you can change your circumstance. I think I'm a living, breathing example of that. I grew up in a very traumatic childhood and did not have good influences, and my parents lived a really hard life. My dad, I didn't even tell you this, but my dad was in prison. He was gang affiliated. Both my parents were meth addicts. Like I saw a lot of domestic violence in my life. And so, do I think that you are doomed if you have, a harsh environment? No. But do I think that it makes it harder? It does, because to your point, when you see the same things over and over and over again, you almost forget what good things are, and you have to have two sides of the coin. And I used to say this all the time. So before I kind of went down my wellness path, if you will, I was smoking a pack of cigarettes a day. I was eating fast food with every single meal. I was partying all the time. And I didn't realize how bad I felt until I had the opposite, until I started trying to change my life and become healthier and change my circumstances. And I started, focusing on my physical health. I started focusing on my nutritional health. I stopped smoking cigarettes. I stopped partying and drinking. And I was like, wow, I didn't know that I felt so bad until I knew what it was like to feel good. And so I think that to your point, we have to constantly be trying to find the opposition of negativity as much as we possibly can. We need to find the opposition of feeling bad so that we know what it's like to feel good and we can stay on that path of like trying to continue to feel good and better. And our brains are wired to look for bad stuff already. And then you're exposed to 20, 30 years of bad stuff, you have to be able to unwind some of those things. And so um, I think that the more we can try again to be proactive with, like you said, washing off that mud before it becomes a problem, the better. And I'm curious, to hear from you. How did you get through it? How were you able to, quote unquote, wash off that mud and be proactive and still be in this career 32 years later?
You know, I think that just nearly everybody goes into this job, and then you have to be passionate about wanting to do this job. It's not for everybody. So for the new people who are deciding they want to be in law enforcement, I would just say make sure it's something that you really want to do. Meaning, talk to all the people in the profession already. Take criminal justice classes, those sort of thing, in order to make sure it's what you really want to do. I knew going in, this is really what I wanted to do. Once you go into it, though, every 7 to 10 years, give or take, you have, burnout. And as I mentioned earlier, changing my scenery, meaning move from one unit to the other, I think helped me with that.
Yeah.
After certain, nationwide events happened, where there was all of this anti-police rhetoric that was out there, I had probably a burnout again. That was probably somewhere around 20, 25 years of service in, it's like, why do I do this? And I'll tell you just something that was kind of funny, and people kind of, I don't say made fun of me at the time, was that I began noticing during the the height of the anti-police stuff that was going on across the country, I would notice that I'd be out eating somewhere, and somebody would come up and they would say, "Hey, thank you." They'd touch me on the shoulder. I appreciate what you do. Just know that there are those of us out there who care, that sort of thing. Unbeknownst to me, they'd buy my lunch. I'd go to pay. They would have already bought it and that sort of thing. And I'm like, this is great for me. Meaning, it really helps to have that positive moment that I'm not having at work. Okay. That's why I'm a big believer now. I didn't create this stuff, by the way. I'm a believer in it. Once I see how it works, I think, man, we need to do more of that. Positive encounters, that sort of thing. So
Mhm.
that's how my personnel, for instance, you're driving down the road, wave to people, be happy, because eventually you keep waving and smiling, you're going to start believing that yourself, right? You see somebody on the side of the road, stop and have a conversation with them, attend, community dinners, do different things in order to kind of have that positive reinforcement that we're not getting at work. So anyways, I fall back here to what I was saying about the people who came and would buy my lunch, say thank you for what you do, those sort of things. Being kind of a nerd here, technology wise, I said, I got to document this thing somehow. And the very first person that I asked to do this, she was happy to do it. And I said, hey, would you mind taking a selfie with me? And she said, I would love to do that. It was an elderly lady. Next thing I know, she's over there. She's fixing her hair. She's adjusting her glasses. She's like, all right, let's do it. So I took a selfie of me and her. This is probably 10 years ago now. And I probably have, I don't know, 50 selfies now of people who do that. And I just started capturing it. Every time somebody would come up, and they'd have to say the right words because I just don't want to take a ton of selfies. I would always ask for their permission. I never had once somebody turn me down, and I would just take a selfie of me and that person. And it really means so much to look back through those pictures and just see all these people smiling and just being happy and just being supportive of the profession that we have. And so I've shared those sometimes, and it kind of almost makes me emotional talking about it. But again, going back to what you initially asked me was change your scenery. Be healthy, talk to others, have those positive encounters with people, and just know that there are people out there who care.
I really like that a lot. You have to have like a selfie wall at some point
I
somewhere.
should. I've
Um,
actually thought about that.
I really like the idea of find the good. Like make those steps to find those things that are going to light you up because we know, I mean, I've never talked to anyone in law enforcement who didn't get into this profession because they want to help people, because they want to do what's good for the community, and to your point, I think, over time maybe you start to maybe lose that sense a little bit and to be able to find that again. I really like that. And you reminded me there was I had another guest on the podcast, and they were talking about their hardest time that they've ever had in their career, and they were contemplating suicide. And they had like ran into someone and we'll have to go back and like watch it to get the exact story because I don't want to quote him, verbatim, but just from my memory. There was someone that they had worked with that like bought themselves flowers, and I guess he had asked like what makes you happy, and they're like, well, I buy myself flowers, and he was like, eye roll, like flowers, like what, like that's lame or whatever. And they were like, well, I just do it every week and it makes me really happy. And so, like, that's what I do. And he's in like one of the darkest times of his life. And he's like, you know what? I'm going to try this. I'm going to try this buying myself flowers, and I'm going to try this gratitude thing. And he said that he was in such a dark space that no matter where he looked or how hard he tried, he could not find anything that he was grateful for. He couldn't see the good in anything. And so what he did is he used these flowers as an artificial way to create gratitude. And so he sat down and he's like, okay, if I can't be grateful for anything, I'm going to find things that I can be grateful for right now in this like bouquet of flowers. He said he bought like a $3 one at the store, it was like about to expire or whatever. Um, and so he was like, okay, I'm going to be grateful for the colors. Those look pretty. I'm going to be grateful for the smell and so he starts like just thinking about the qualities of these flowers, and he did that every single day, and he did that for like several weeks, I think he said, until he was able to zoom out and be able to find other things within his life that he was grateful for. But he had to find it first, like almost force himself to find it first in this bouquet of flowers. And so I really like that concept of no matter how hard things are, no matter how bad you feel, even if you can't, maybe in that moment find something to be grateful for, something good, you can find it. You might just have to like artificially force yourself to find it first. And then it's like the red car theory. Once you start seeing these things, like it's easier to spot them throughout your life, but it's almost like that practice and that habit you have to create first.
Sure. And I want to say, just throw in another story there. When I first started here, the one thing they do at this agency that I'm in charge of now is they celebrate every officer's birthday. How do
Mhm.
they go about doing that? They buy a cake, whatever cake the officer might like, and they call everybody in and they hand them the cake. Well, one thing I noticed right off the bat was that nobody's saying happy birthday. I know that sounds so dumb or so childlike, but nobody is saying happy birthday. It was like you had the cake, you had them the cake, and it's like, all right, hey, happy birthday, here's your cake. Everybody cuts up the cake, they all stand around and talk, and then they walk off, right? So after like the one or two of these, I'm like, okay, well, somebody's got to sing happy birthday. So I started singing happy birthday all by myself with 6 or 8 people standing around to the employee whose birthday it was. And everybody looked at me like, what is going on here? Why is he singing happy birthday? And my statement was, everybody deserves to get happy birthday sang to you because you think back to when you were a kid, happy time, and it's a great thing, right? Everybody deserves to hear happy birthday sang to them when it's their birthday. I don't care how old you are, whether you're 25 or whether you're 105, you should have happy birthday sang to you, right?
Yeah.
And so after several of these birthdays, one of our officers actually said, "Hey, I'll sing." And he sang, so he and I would sing. And this was over the next 5, 10 birthdays or whatever. Now, just the other day, we had a birthday in here, And we had 6 or 8 people standing around, and I bet you 5 to 6 of those people actually sang happy birthday when we had the happy birthday thing. And they thought, I mean, to me, I'm telling you, I first did it by myself, they looked at me like I was crazy. Like, who was this guy coming in here singing happy birthday? And the fact that that many people did it out of there, I'm feeling like, yes, like it's a small win that, that we're creating that environment. I'm a big believer in if I can create an environment where people love to come to work, I'm doing the
Mhm.
right thing. I would rather force them to go home than to have to drag them to come to work because what they're putting out in society is a much better product in the end because they're happy, right? And they're smiling. They're doing great things for the community. But if they're here because I had to drag them to work, it's horrible. And so if I could sing happy birthday, or if I could take a selfie with somebody, or if I could do these, what most people would probably be say is silly things, well, then hopefully I'm doing the right things.
I really like that. I think that negativity is contagious. I also think positivity is contagious. And I want to know, like, when did we lose, when did we lose that like ability to like just like have joy and be silly and have fun? Like when, like where in our lives, if we like look at the timeline, like where did we lose that? I think that everyone is so worried about being cool. Everyone's like, oh, that's lame or that's stupid or,
Uh,
yeah.
uh,
And do you know what I think is cool? I think being positive and being happy and being kind. Like I think that's cool. And so I don't know where we lost that on our timeline, but I think that if we come back to some of those simple things, that it would be such a better world. If we stopped judging all the stuff and we were like willing to be a little silly and like willing to like have fun and sing and, dance around a little bit and take selfies. And, like that to me sounds like a much better world than standing around with your arms crossed, being like, I'm not going to do that. That's stupid, and then judging everyone around you. So I like that you're trying to create that environment. And I think that that is wellness, like how can you create a culture where people are happier and healthier and it's a healthier organization? And like you said, people want to come to work and they feel valued for the work that they do. And then when they're out in the community, they're more likely to have more positive interactions with the community, which is a two-way street, like you said, because the community is going to fill you up and you're going to be able to help them. And that feels good to have that positive exchange with people. My question to you is, how do you think, because you mentioned this earlier, you mentioned that there's still stigma and challenges with kind of creating that culture and infusing wellness and providing like wellness programming and resources. How do you think organizations can start to build that culture, and how can we start to break that stigma? Like I know it's happening, like we see it happening, and things look different now than they used to, but what do you think is maybe like the thing that's still missing to where, stigma is still existing?
Number one, I think we have to change the whole, this person's just an employee or a number. I think you have to have some sort of personal relationship. You don't have to know what that person does every single day of their life, but you should try to have some sort of personal connection there, right? And then you treat everybody with respect, hoping you would get back what you're putting out. I've always said treat everybody would want a family member to be treated by somebody else, right? I mean, so as long as you're doing that, I think that increases the presence of the entire agency. Um, and then number one, don't or number two, don't be scared to admit that, and that comes from the top down, that hey, we're all human. And you mentioned this earlier. I like some of the agencies now are doing this. The human behind the badge, or humanizing the badge is what they call it, or these different things where they introduce their officers to the public, and then it allows the public to say, hey, we're not just robots walking around out here with guns on our hips. We are human beings, and we suffer from the same things that you all do. And then having that open and honest conversations within the organization to say, hey, if you need help, we have all of these great resources now. We didn't always have them, or if we had them, they weren't well represented throughout because people didn't know about them.
Hmm.
And don't be afraid to say, hey, even I, and I say even I, as I'm some big superhero on the mountain. No, I'm not. I'm just a human, just like everybody else. But I say, even I, as the chief of police, hey, I've talked to people about, wellness and things that may have bothered me. And once you're able to kind of like let it go and start to release that negative energy out of you by talking about it, it really does allow you to get room for oxygen that's being taken up by all this negative stuff. And then you start breathing easier. And the next thing you know, you're like, okay, I feel better now that I've talked about that. I've gotten it off my chest, just able to vent to somebody.
Yeah.
The peer support is a great tool that some agencies are doing. And just it's like a tanker out in the middle of an ocean. You can't expect it to turn, 180 degrees in 30 seconds. It takes a long time for that tanker to turn one way or the other. And
Mm.
I feel like being a law enforcement organization, it's the same way. It's like you come in, you mentioned how people are afraid of change. It is. That's one of the biggest things I've noticed here is that, people don't like to be outside their comfort zone. And what is their comfort zone? That means what they've done every single day,
Hmm.
right? And even if that is, I haven't reached out for help, because we don't normally do that around here, that's change. And so it all ties together. If you can start picking off little pieces here and there to where the organization begins to change the culture. Not saying it was bad. I'm just saying there's always room for improvement. And so,
Yeah.
anyways,
I like that you said that because I do, like, I try to be really careful with the way that I speak too, because I think that sometimes the messaging that comes out is that, like, we need to change the entire culture. And everyone's like, whoa, 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 pump the brakes. And like everyone's on the defense. And
sure.
I think you're right. I think there's so many great things about your culture. Like there's honor and integrity and all the things that you stand for are so positive. And it's not that we're trying to come in and wipe all that clean at all. But to your point, how can there be improvements? How can there be forward growth to make sure that the people within the organization are set up for success so that they can do their job in an honorable way with integrity, that they can be healthier and happier so that they have better home lives and less divorce rates, and they're not seeking unhealthy coping mechanisms, and they're not contemplating suicide because they don't have the resources that they need to be able to process some of the things. How can we get to that point where it's not viewed in that way, where it's a defensive thing? It's like, no, this is a really good thing. Like this is for you to like make sure that like you are as successful as you possibly can be, not just in a career, but like once you retire, like there's nothing more sad to me than when you hear of someone retiring and a couple of years later they're gone, and they didn't have the chance or the opportunity to extend that retirement because, maybe they didn't have the resources that they needed, and they were struggling internally. And so I think it's only for the betterment of everybody, and I think that that has to be the message moving forward.
Absolutely. And it reminds me of a study that I read here several years ago. And there was a large agency, they did a study on about the average lifespan of a person who retires from a particular career. And I think it was somewhere around 20, 25 years for non-law enforcement personnel. But then they found that if the law enforcement personnel was like 5 to 7 years. And so they said, why do we have such this drastic difference between the two? They started doing exactly what you were talking about like because of the repeated exposure to stress and the unhealthy coping mechanisms and just all these different things that it's like if we can change just a little bit, affect one person differently today than we did yesterday, maybe eventually we'll start closing that gap of surviving after retirement because that's ultimately what it's all about in the long run
Yeah.
is that I want to live a long, healthy life, and I hope that I'm making the right choices in order to do that.
Yeah. And I think I would even take it a step further and saying like thriving.
Yes,
When I there's a book that I was listening to recently on audiobook, but gosh, I'm not gonna remember the name now. It was something about longevity. I'll have to find it and I can share it with you offline. But um he was saying it's not about the amount of years, like, and of course you want it to be as many years as possible, but what's the point if like those years are not lived well? if you're not thriving in those years. And so I think that we want both, right? We want to extend the years, but we also want to extend the quality of life within those years, because
Yes.
who wants to be, you know, unable to move and like bedridden for the last 15 years of your life? You don't want that. You want to be able to physically move. So the importance of mobility and injury prevention and all the things. You want to be able to mentally be well so that you can run around with your grandkids, or, you can go on a cruise for the rest of your life. I don't know. I've been seeing some stories about like people who are retiring on cruises. That sounds great. But like, how can you do the things that you want to do after this career and thrive? And so I think that that has to be the message. Like, we don't want you to like limp to the finish line here. Like, we want you to be upright, like power walking through the finish line.
I will say one of the big takeaways from this entire conversation is movement. What,
Movement.
well,
Yeah,
yeah, whether you're moving in your job, whether you're physically moving, whether you just move somehow, some way.
I love it. Yeah. My final question for you before we kind of sign off for the day, and you've already given a lot of really amazing advice, but for that younger officer, what words of wisdom would you share? Maybe something that you wish you would have known earlier, or something that's helped you along the way.
First of all, I would say just, and I mentioned this earlier, just know and understand this is a very challenging career. But if you have the passion, follow your passion. Big believer in that. If I can allow my people to do that here, and if it's what I needed to do, that I allow them to do it, they're much more successful. So make sure you're passionate about doing this job. And if you are, you're going to be very successful. And I would just say, don't get down. If you apply for a particular agency, you don't get it, apply for a different agency and keep applying at different places until you finally make the cut, if you will. And you're going to find yourself very rewarded, both internally, maybe not so much, physically, that sort of thing, because, the stress is kind of bad on our career, but find ways to make yourself better. And I would say start from day one, putting some money away, because this isn't you're not going to get rich being a law enforcement officer. So make sure that you can set yourself up for retirement in the end, by putting just a little bit away each day or each paycheck. And so at the very end, you're find yourself not having to do this and do what I would say a lot of officers do, which is they start relying on their part-time jobs, meaning they work extra jobs. And before you know it, they're not making enough on their full-time job to pay their bills. And so they're working 3 or 4 other jobs. And these guys are working 40 hours at their normal job. They're working 20, 30, 40 hours at their part-time jobs, and they're working themselves to death.
Mm,
So find a way to where you can actually live, in your means and not beyond your means, and set yourself up for retirement and move. Like we talked about earlier, just continue to challenge yourself. Look for what's next. When you become complacent in a position, start thinking, what other opportunities do I have here? Whether it's laterally or whether it's, advancement, just look to challenge yourself to learn new things and to be excited about what you do every day.
yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate everything you're doing here.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And thank you for coming on here and spending an hour with me. And it really honestly was an honor. So thank you.
Well, thank you, ma'am. Now I'm worried about being judged. Here we talk about being judged. People are going to watch this. They're going to be like, "Who is this clown?"
No
So
way. And
let's hope it goes well.
anyone, yeah, well, and anyone who's listening, it's like I have to watch myself and judge myself every single day on these things. So I have had to like really build up self-confidence with that.
Sure.
But I think it's the mission, right? It's like the mission is greater than anything else. And it's, like you said earlier, like if we can influence one person, if we can help someone take a step in a better direction, and keep that movement going, and give them maybe an idea or an inspiration or an educational piece that like helps them out, I think it's worth everything. So
Absolutely. I agree 100%.
thank you.